Dietrich Bonhoeffer stands as one of the most significant Christian figures of the 20th century, a German Protestant theologian, pastor, and unwavering opponent of Nazism, whose life and work continue to resonate across faith traditions and global conversations about ethics and justice. Born on February 4, 1906, in Breslau, Bonhoeffer grew up in a distinguished academic family. His father was a renowned psychiatrist, and several siblings went on to become leaders in their fields. From an early age, he showed exceptional intellectual curiosity and a deep commitment to his faith, beginning his theological studies at Tübingen University before transferring to Berlin, where he studied under leading scholars like Adolf von Harnack. At just 21 years old, he completed his doctoral dissertation, Sanctorum Communio, which laid the groundwork for his lifelong exploration of the nature of Christian community. In 1931, he traveled to New York to study at Union Theological Seminary. During this time, his work with black congregations in Harlem exposed him to systemic injustice and racial inequality, fundamentally shaping his belief that faith must be lived out through action in the world. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, Bonhoeffer was among the first German church leaders to speak out against the regime's anti-Semitic policies and its attempt to subordinate Christianity to Nazi ideology through the creation of the German Christian movement. He played a pivotal role in founding the Confessing Church, a network of pastors and congregations dedicated to upholding biblical truth and resisting state control of religious life. To train a new generation of leaders committed to this vision, he led an illegal seminary in Finkenwald, where students were taught not only theology, but also the importance of standing against oppression. As the regime's brutality intensified, Bonhoeffer came to believe that passive resistance was insufficient. In 1940, he joined the Abwehr, a military intelligence agency that had become a cover for anti-Nazi resistance activities, and became actively involved in plots to overthrow Hitler and end the war. His resistance work led to his arrest in April 1943, and he spent the final 2 years of his life in prisons and concentration camps, including Tegel Prison in Berlin and later Flossenburg. Even in confinement, he continued to write, producing reflections that would be collected posthumously in letters and papers from prison, a profound meditation on faith, suffering, and the meaning of life in the face of evil. On April 9, 1945, just 3 weeks before Flossenburg was liberated by Allied forces, Bonhoeffer was executed by the SS. His legacy endures through influential works like The Cost of Discipleship, which challenges believers to embrace radical obedience to Christ rather than a comfortable nominal faith, and Ethics, which explores how Christian principles should guide moral decision-making in complex political and social contexts. Honored globally as a martyr for justice, he is commemorated with a statue at Westminster Abbey as part of the 20th Century Martyrs Memorial, and his ideas continue to inspire movements for human rights, racial equality, and ethical leadership in both religious and secular spheres. Bonhoeffer's theology was deeply rooted in the belief that faith cannot be separated from ethical action or engagement with the world. In The Cost of Discipleship, he famously critiqued what he called cheap grace, the idea that forgiveness and salvation can be claimed without commitment to living out Christ's teachings. Instead, he advocated for costly grace, which demands radical obedience, self-denial, and solidarity with the marginalized. His time in Harlem reinforced this focus on social justice, leading him to argue that the church must stand with those suffering under oppression, whether from racial inequality, authoritarian rule, or systemic injustice. While imprisoned, he also explored concepts like religionless Christianity, suggesting that faith should be expressed through love and service rather than ritual or dogma alone, an idea that continues to resonate with people seeking authentic ways to live out their beliefs in a secular age. Today, his work is invoked by movements addressing issues like racial justice, climate action, and human rights, as leaders draw on his example of choosing courage over comfort and principle over pragmatism. His emphasis on community, seen in his work with the Confessing Church and the Finkenwald Seminary, also reminds us that meaningful change is often built through collective effort and shared commitment to justice. Let's dive into how Bonhoeffer's ideas have been applied in modern racial justice movements, particularly in contexts like the Black Lives Matter movement and efforts to address systemic racism globally. Bonhoeffer's experiences in 1930s Harlem left an indelible mark on his understanding of justice. He witnessed how racial segregation and economic inequality dehumanized communities, and he linked this to the same dehumanizing logic he later saw in Nazi anti-Semitism. In his writing, he emphasized that the church is the church only when it exists for others, a principle that modern racial justice advocates have embraced to argue that faith communities must actively challenge oppression, not just offer comfort. For example, many Christian leaders in the BLM movement have drawn on his critique of cheap grace to push back against passive expressions of faith that acknowledge injustice but take no action. They point to his willingness to risk his life to stand with marginalized groups as a model for confronting white supremacy and structural inequities. Additionally, his focus on community, seen in the Confessing Church's collective resistance, mirrors how modern movements build coalitions across races, faiths, and backgrounds to demand change. In Singapore and other diverse societies, his ideas also inform efforts to address racial divides, encouraging people to move beyond tolerance to active solidarity and advocacy for equitable policies. Contemporary theologians and activists often cite his line from Letters and Papers from Prison: "We must learn to regard people less in the light of what they do or omit to do, and more in the light of what they suffer," as a call to center the experiences of those most affected by injustice. Let's explore how Dietrich Bonhoeffer's work has shaped social justice, communal harmony, and resistance movements across Southeast Asia, a region marked by extraordinary cultural, religious, and ethnic diversity, as well as complex histories of colonialism, authoritarian rule, and efforts to build inclusive societies. His ideas about faith in action, community solidarity, and standing against oppression have resonated deeply with leaders, theologians, and activists who navigate the unique challenges of this part of the world. Theological foundations translated to local contexts. Bonhoeffer's emphasis on communal life, central to his early work Sanctorum Communio, has been particularly meaningful in Southeast Asia, where collective identity and mutual responsibility are core to many cultural and religious traditions. In places like Singapore and Malaysia, where multi-ethnic, multi-faith societies are the norm, theologians have drawn on his vision of the church as a community for others to bridge divides between different religious and ethnic groups. For example, in Singapore, interfaith organizations like the Interreligious Organization have referenced Bonhoeffer's belief that faith must be lived out through tangible acts of care and cooperation. Leaders in these groups argue that his critique of cheap grace, which prioritizes empty ritual over meaningful action, speaks directly to the need for faith communities to move beyond mere tolerance and actively work toward equity and understanding. In Malaysia, where tensions between Malay Muslim, Chinese, and Indian communities have at times strained social cohesion, Christian theologians have used Bonhoeffer's ideas to advocate for costly solidarity, choosing to stand with marginalized groups even when it risks controversy. Confronting racial and communal divides. Southeast Asia's history of colonialism and post-independence nation-building has left lasting legacies of racial inequality and communal tension, and Bonhoeffer's experiences of witnessing injustice in Harlem and resisting Nazi racism have provided a framework for addressing these issues. In Indonesia, for instance, after the 1998 riots that targeted Chinese Indonesian communities, religious leaders turned to Bonhoeffer's writing to articulate a theology of accountability and repair. They emphasized his point that silence in the face of evil is itself evil, arguing that faith communities cannot remain neutral when violence or discrimination targets vulnerable groups. In Thailand, where ethnic minorities like the Karen and Hmong have faced displacement and marginalization, activists and church leaders have drawn on his model of the Confessing Church to create networks that advocate for land rights and protect communities from exploitation. These groups see themselves as continuing Bonhoeffer's work, building spaces of resistance and care that prioritize the dignity of those most affected by injustice. Resisting authoritarianism and advocating for human rights, several Southeast Asian countries have grappled with authoritarian rule in recent decades, and Bonhoeffer's decision to oppose Nazi tyranny, even at the cost of his life, has inspired activists and religious leaders who stand up to oppressive governments. In the Philippines, during the Marcos dictatorship, Catholic and Protestant leaders drew on Bonhoeffer's ideas to justify their opposition to martial law. Figures like Archbishop Jaime Cardinal Sin referenced the cost of discipleship to argue that faith demanded resistance to corruption, human rights abuses, and the suppression of political freedoms. Similarly, in Myanmar, before and during the 2021 military coup, Christian leaders and civil society activists have invoked Bonhoeffer's example to explain why they cannot remain silent in the face of violence against the Rohingya minority and the repression of pro-democracy movements. While the context differs vastly from 1930s Germany, His insistence that the church must not adapt to the world's ways, but transform them, has provided moral clarity for those taking risks to defend human dignity. Justice for marginalized groups, migrant workers, and indigenous communities. Southeast Asia is home to millions of migrant workers, many from countries like Myanmar, Cambodia, and Vietnam, who often face exploitation, low wages, and limited legal protections. In Singapore, where migrant workers form a critical part of the workforce, faith-based organizations like the Migrant Workers Center have drawn on Bonhoeffer's emphasis on seeing the other to guide their work. They cite his writing from prison, where he reflected on the importance of recognizing the humanity of all people, regardless of their status or background. These groups provide housing, legal aid, and community support to migrant workers, framing their efforts as a practical expression of Bonhoeffer's theology of love in action. In the Philippines and Indonesia, indigenous communities fighting to protect their lands from mining and logging companies have also turned to his ideas, viewing their struggle as a form of costly discipleship that requires standing firm against powerful interests to safeguard their way of life and the environment. Contemporary applications and ongoing dialogues. Today, Bonhoeffer's work continues to shape conversations about faith, justice, and community in Southeast Asia. Universities and theological institutions across the region, including Singapore's Trinity Theological College and Indonesia's Gadjah Mada University, teach his writings as part of courses on ethics and social theology. Young activists and leaders are adapting his ideas to address new challenges, from climate change to digital rights, arguing that the dehumanization of people online requires the same kind of resistance as offline injustice. In Malaysia, for example, youth-led movements advocating for climate action have referenced Bonhoeffer to argue that caring for the planet is inseparable from caring for marginalized communities most affected by global warming. In summary, Bonhoeffer's legacy in Southeast Asia lies not in rigid adherence to his specific actions or context, but in the enduring questions he raises. What does it mean to live a life of faith in a world marked by injustice? How can communities stand together to resist oppression while honoring diversity? And what does it cost, and what is gained when we choose to act for justice rather than remain comfortable in silence? His work reminds people across the region that meaningful change requires both courage and community, and that faith, when lived fully, demands engagement with the world's most pressing challenges.